Japan's Southeast Asia occupation, from the fall of Singapore to the Spice Islands. Japanese forces didn't stop at Pearl Harbor or the Philippines when war erupted across the Pacific in late 1941. In a swift campaign driven by the thirst for resources, they advanced through Malaya, seized Singapore, long hailed as an impregnable British fortress, and pushed into the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. This lightning expansion netted them rubber, tin, and oil reserves critical for sustaining war production. Unlike the carefully planned naval engagements in the Central Pacific, the conquest of Southeast Asia combined land, sea, and air assaults across vast tropical territories. The operation's initial success was so absolute that within a matter of weeks, major colonial strongholds fell like dominoes, leaving the Allies reeling. Central to Japan's ambitions was Malaya, whose valuable tin and rubber had become indispensable for powering military industries. Landing on the Thai coast and then sweeping south by bicycle and truck convoys, the Imperial Japanese Army shocked British commanders who had underestimated the speed and resolve of this offensive. By early February 1942, they had cornered British and Commonwealth troops in Singapore. That fortress city, lauded as the keystone of British defense in Asia, collapsed under relentless Japanese bombings and infiltration tactics. General Arthur Percival's surrender marked one of Britain's most humiliating defeats, with tens of thousands of Allied soldiers taken captive. For Japan, capturing Singapore was more than a strategic coup. It became a symbol of their ascendancy over the once mighty Western powers in Asia. From Singapore, the Japanese eyed their next lucrative target, the Dutch East Indies, rich in oil fields. Java and Sumatra hosted reserves that could fuel Japan's navy and air force, which had long been hamstrung by limited petroleum supplies. With the momentum from their Malayan blitz, they overcame scattered Allied naval groups in the Java Sea. Many local garrisons crumbled beneath precision airstrikes and methodical land invasions. For the Netherlands, already under Nazi occupation in Europe, the loss of its prized colony in Asia was a devastating economic and moral blow. Meanwhile, Tokyo extolled a pan-Asian message of liberation from Western imperialism under its Great East Asia County prosperity sphere, though in practice, Japanese forces replaced one colonial master with another. Occupied populations soon discovered that Japan's rhetoric of Asia for Asians belied harsh realities. In Malaya and Singapore, local ethnic tensions deepened as the new occupiers singled out certain communities, especially the Chinese, for brutal reprisals, linking them to ongoing conflict in China. Forced labor became common, with the infamous death railway in Thailand Burma as one grim example of how Japan exploited prisoners of war and civilians alike. The Kempeitai, Japan's military police, wielded absolute power, carrying out arrests, interrogations, and torture in the name of rooting out resistance. On Java and other islands, Japan claimed local nationalism was being encouraged, but any whisper of genuine independence was quickly stifled. In many zones, an oppressive climate of fear and scarcity reigned, with vital resources commandeered for the Japanese war effort. Despite initial shock, resistance movements began to form across Southeast Asia. Guerrilla fighters, sometimes aided by Allied Special Operations units, sabotaged Japanese supply lines and launched hit-and-run attacks. Local communist groups in Malaya, nationalists in Indonesia, and scattered British-backed guerrillas in Burma all posed steady, if limited, threats. Japanese garrisons soon found themselves stretched thin, juggling duties from policing civilian populations to defending against potential Allied counterstrikes. When the tide of the broader Pacific War began turning after Midway and Guadalcanal, Japan lacked the resources to reinforce these far-flung territories. This left occupation troops increasingly isolated, battling both indigenous insurgents and Allied offensives that crept steadily closer. By 1943 and 1944, Allied submarine warfare and strategic bombing hammered Japan's shipping lanes, choking off the very raw materials, rubber, tin, oil, that had originally propelled their Southeast Asia conquest. Local economies ground down under forced requisitions, triggering famine in some regions. And as Allied forces drove into Burma and the Philippines, the Imperial Japanese Army had to redeploy units from places like Sumatra and Malaya for defense. This created a vacuum that emboldened resistance fighters. In Indonesia, for instance, young nationalists benefited from Japanese promises of future self-rule, yet quietly prepared for a post-war scenario where they might declare independence on their own terms. When the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced Japan's sudden capitulation in August 1945, Japan's Southeast Asian occupation unraveled almost overnight. Imperial forces surrendered piecemeal, leaving confusion among local populations who had endured years of harsh governance. In the Dutch East Indies, a quick vacuum emerged, enabling nationalist leaders like Sukarno and Hatta to proclaim Indonesian independence, igniting a colonial conflict with the returning Dutch. In Malaya, the British eventually resumed control, but communist guerrillas refused to disband, setting the stage for a later insurgency. Meanwhile, Singapore and other territories faced the colossal task of rebuilding shattered infrastructure and restarting commerce in a climate rife with political and ethnic tensions. The occupation's legacy in Southeast Asia was thus deeply complex. It accelerated the decline of European colonial empires while simultaneously exacting a brutal toll on local societies. Japan's vision of co-prosperity crumbled under the realities of exploitation, forced labor, and resource extraction. Far from uniting Asia under a benevolent banner, the occupation left deep scars that would influence post-war decolonization and independence movements. For the Japanese military, the gamble of conquering territory across Southeast Asia for resources seemed promising at first but proved unsustainable, especially once Allied forces reorganized and leveraged their industrial might. The downfall of Japanese rule in Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies became another piece in the broader collapse of Tokyo's grand wartime ambitions. Looking back, historians see these campaigns as defining moments in WWII's Pacific theater. The fall of Singapore remains a watershed in British colonial history, shattering the illusion of Western invincibility. Indonesia's tumultuous path to freedom traces directly back to Japan's occupation, which disrupted Dutch power and galvanized local nationalism. Malaya's post-war course was likewise shaped by the bitter memories of occupation and collaboration, eventually fueling a sense of unique national identity. Across the region, the war's end brought a mixture of relief, chaos, and rapid political change. Japanese troops in these lands went from triumphant invaders to occupiers desperately trying to hold on, and finally, to defeated soldiers tasked with disarmament or facing war crimes proceedings. In the post-war era, many voices from the occupied territories recounted the brutalities, massacres, forced labor, sexual slavery, yet also remembered the unity such suffering forged. Allied war crimes trials tried some Japanese commanders for atrocities committed in places like Singapore's Chinatown or the coerced marches in Borneo, but not all perpetrators were held accountable. Meanwhile, some local elites initially supported or collaborated with the Japanese, hoping it would expedite independence from the West. For them, the end of occupation brought complicated reckonings. The tangled tapestry of alliances, betrayals, and anti-colonial sentiment that emerged under Japanese occupation laid much of the groundwork for Southeast Asia's eventual wave of independence movements in the late 1940s and 1950s. From the vantage of Japan itself, the campaign in Southeast Asia stands as a prime example of overreach, driven by an urgent need for resources yet underestimating the difficulty of administering conquered lands. While the early expansions in 1941-1942 seemed unstoppable, Japan never fully consolidated control in these far-flung territories. The lack of local popular support and the unending demands of a two-front war, fighting China on the mainland and the US in the Pacific, revealed the inherent flaws in their strategy. Allied counteroffensives, local resistances, and logistical nightmares chipped away at Japan's new empire until it finally collapsed under the crushing weight of total defeat in August 1945. Japan's occupation of Southeast Asia thus remains one of WWII's most sweeping yet often under-discussed narratives. It encompassed everything from stunning battlefield victories to horrific human rights abuses, from toppling Western colonial rule to inadvertently paving the way for post-war independence. For millions caught under that occupation, it was a period of fear, scarcity, and oppression. For the broader international community, it served as another stark lesson that swift conquests might look impressive, but without the capacity to govern fairly and sustainably, and without an overwhelming industrial base to back them up, victors can become losers just as quickly. Subscribe to Legends of the Battlefield for more stories of brilliant tactics and legendary leaders.